All right, this is going to be a pretty cool pattern that I've been tying for quite a while now. It's going to be a blue-wing olive emerger. I'm going to tie it a little bit bigger than I normally do just for video purposes. I usually fish this in an 18 or a 20, but I'm going to tie it in a 16 so that we can kind of see it a little bit better. Oops, dropped it. This is ultimately what we're going to end up with. Nothing really crazy, nothing, that's really kind of out of the ordinary. It's basically shaped and tied like any nymph that you would see. The one thing that's different with it is if you look on the top here, there's going to be a little glass bead there to kind of imitate the gases that these nymphs often use to kind of emerge on, and that's what we're trying to imitate with that. So what we'll do is we'll start off with just a thin thread here. I'm using a nano silk GSP. Not that that's really what you need to use, but I had a bobbin already threaded up with it, so hell with it, that's what I'm using. So you don't really need a thread base here. We're just going to kind of get our thread started, and at some point we are going to tie in a few strands of pheasant tail for the tail. We don't really want the tail on this too bulky. A lot of times, if you look at hare's ears and all that, there's a lot of bulk in that tail. You don't really want that with these. You want this to be, if anything, a little bit more of a finesse type fly than a fly with a lot of material in it. So we want to make sure we keep that in mind. So I'm going to give a few turns of that. I'm going to grip this tightly and pull it back through until I get the exact length that I want. And make sure that that's nice and tight down under our thread. That's pretty good right there. So I'm going to hold this tight, try to maintain that grip even though I'm really just gripping the very tips, and work my thread all the way down as deep into the shank as I want to get it. Right there is about good. All right, next order of business. I've got, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but this extra thin, extra small size ultra wire. I like to tie in my wire on my way back up the body. So I'm going to get one turn in to hold it. I'm going to pull that to size it where I want it. And we're going to get some wraps all the way up to the front. And let's see. So we're good right about there. So what I'm going to do is snip that off. And if you notice that where I started my thread, where I ran my wire up to, where I did everything, is generally where I'm going to stop my body. I like to tie in certain things and start my thread and do a number of steps that are all kind of designed around planning my proportions. And right now I'm just building up a little bit of bulk here. I don't really want a ton of dubbing. I want to, it's going to float to some extent. This fly sits in the surface film. More dubbing usually kind of makes it float a little bit longer before it gets a little waterlogged. So I like a little bit less dubbing. And to do that, I'm going to take this very basic standard dubbing. It's just basically hare's ear dubbing dyed olive. Just your basic hairline dubbing olive. It's got a lot of guard hairs in it, and I normally take most of my dubbing straight off of the mask, but for these, I don't use this color very often, so I just buy the package where it's already plucked. And I'm not going to go too heavy with this dubbing noodle. If you watch my other videos or have seen the flies that I usually tie, I like a little bit more control over how I taper my body, and I do that with thin dubbing noodles, and it gives you a little bit more control. So I'm going to kind of hold everything back here while I get this as far back as I'm going to get it. And now that we're applying dubbing, I'm going to move it up. You might have to adjust a little bit, but we already did kind of taper the body a little bit before we started wrapping dubbing, so you won't have to adjust too much. Unless, of course, maybe you run out, which we just did. But that is the worst thing we deal with today, that we're having a pretty damn good day. I just used these the other day on a trip to Maine. and the salmon were all over these things. Usually when I go up there, a lot of brook trout and the occasional salmon. This trip was loads of salmon and the occasional brook trout. Okay, this should be good. So far, we're really just tying this the way you would tie any other standard nymph. All right, and we'll take our wire. We'll run that through. And get that tied off. I mean, so far you're doing all the same things that you would tie on any standard hare's ear, pheasant tail, any other nymph you're tying. That's why I said in the beginning, you know, this pattern's not setting the world on fire, but it is something a little different. And if you have slower, calmer water, there's one spot in particular. I don't know if anybody watching this has ever fished in Pittsburgh, up in northern New Hampshire, but there's a spot up there that is like the perfect classic calmer water. See, these nymphs are, they can swim, but they're not very good swimmers. So generally what these nymphs tend to do is get out of the current and get into the slack water, get into the calmer stuff a little bit more. That's where they can kind of emerge a little bit more in peace. Well, I mean, not really in peace when you got fish trying to feed on you, but they like to move into the slacker water and emerge there. So if you have any, eddies or any little areas away from the major current, that's a really, really good spot to fish these. They're really, really effective. You can give them little twitches because they are swimmers. They're not very good swimmers, but you can give them little twitches, give them a little dart, and that'll kind of stir some fish on. So next deal is we're going to have some .007 mono. Just bought a spool of this. And we're going to get that tied in before we tie in our wing case. Okay, so the way that I do this is I'm just going to take a strand of this. Probably cut a little too much, but oh well. I'm going to get that wedged right in there with my thread, get a loose wrap just to get it secured. And then I'm going to go around and tighten it. And as I tighten it, I'm going to pull this up to get it on the top of the shank. You want that to be right directly on top of the shank. And we're good there. All right, next order of business. Do I have any of these out already? Nope, I got to pick a new one. So here's my bead stacker. Great little desktop tool. Holds all my beads, holds everything right in there. And in one of these compartments, I have a compartment designated for these clear glass beads. These I get at a craft store. You can go into any craft store and you can buy a package of, honestly, you can buy a lifetime supply for, just a couple of bucks. They come so many in a package. The real intended use for these is not supposed to be, single use, which one fly uses one bead. So one package of these beads will last me probably till well after I die. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to string that bead onto that mono, which you can kind of see there, just came down. I'm not going to tie it in yet. I'm just going to get it on the mono, and then I'm going to set my mono back out of the way. Now, once we get to that point, what we want to do now is we want to get the wing case on there. And to do that, we're just going to use a standard pheasant tail wing case. Again, as I said, the vast majority of this fly is the same as any other standard nymph. So all I'm going to do is take a nice chunk of pheasant tail here, get these all lined up. We'll get the tips snipped off. Line those up. There we go. So let's get those there, flatten them out with my thumb, collect them all with a loose wrap. And then once they're all in there, we'll tighten that down. Thorax going to be the same color, still the same olive hair. Not going to change anything with that. So we'll go in and get a nice thin noodle of this too. You know, depending on who's watching this, if you are a newer tyer, make sure that you're using a nice tight rope. You're not letting that get out of control. When you get your flies in your early years that are looking kind of crazy and all over the place, a lot of times it's just you don't have any control over your dubbing. A lot of the rookie mistakes, I often see some big time overdubbing. All right, that should be good. You can always add more later, so don't try to nail the exact amount. It is kind of cool when you do nail it, but don't waste your time trying to do that. And I want to make sure I keep this kind of slender. That's about, I don't want to go that much. Go one time. Yeah, I just wanted to fill that in a little bit. There we go. That's what we want. All right. For the legs, I'm just going to use your standard partridge. In this case, I'm going to use medium done. Done is usually what the blue wings call for in terms of hackle. I don't think it's terribly important with this pattern, but you could use natural, you could use whatever else you have. But I have done, I'm going to use done. Just get a piece out. So the way that I do my legs, I try to find a piece of partridge that is a little bit more flat on the top. When you look through your bag, you see all different kinds of feathers, all different kinds of shapes, sizes. If you can get the type that is flat on the top, that's important because no matter how far down the stem you go, your feathers will still, your barbs will still be aligned at the tips. So if you can get one of those that is nice and flat on top, those are perfect. Same goes true for when you are putting in dry wings on a dry fly. If you can get the type that have the flat top, you're really, really in business. So what I do is I notch it out just like that. I'm going to gather these and get these tied in directly on the side with one loose wrap to hold them, and then we'll tighten them down. There you go. Now I'll bend this over to the other side, get the other side tied in, try to line them up. If you don't line them up, you could always just slide it and size them, but it is easier if you just lock it in and they're all set up. Perfect. Now I got to adjust that a little. Pull it till it's straight. And we'll get nice tight wraps on there and that won't go anywhere. These copter scissors are pretty amazing. They're a little pricey, but if you can spring for them, you can really get that tip in there and do some seriously precise cutting. Okay, so everything looks good. We got the legs in. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bring the wing case up over the top. Get a wrap on there to secure that. Get it down. I mean, you can cut this off now if you want. Actually, I think I was gonna leave it, but no biggie. Okay, and the final step, as I lift up my mono, that bead will slide down. Now, I don't want the bead over here by the head. I want the bead right here on the thorax. So as I pull the mono forward, I'm just gonna kind of hold that bead down. Oops. As I pull this down, and eventually you'll see that it'll kind of move forward and kind of right where you want it. So while I'm holding that mono, I'm going to bring my thread up over the top, get one wrap in there to kind of lock it in place where I want it. And then I'm going to pull everything back and give it a few really, really good firm wraps. And once those wraps are in there, now that's pretty much locked right into place. All right, for the last step for the mono, I don't cut mono with my good scissors. So I take a pair of clippers and I get those right up to the thread snip that off clean. And now there's nothing left. We can finish with a nice wrap here. Get that head built up nice. What I also do, if I can find, here we go, is I've got a collection of markers, all different kinds of colors. This nano thread takes color really, really well. So I got an olive marker here. I'm going to take that thread, I'm going to color that up. We'll go get a whip finish on that. You can head cement it if you want. I'm not a big fan of head cement. I rarely use it, barely ever. I only really ever use it on my soft hackles where I want a little bit of a glossier head. Not on this. So that looks pretty good. That's basically what we're looking for. Those are the legs, the top, the bead on top. Again, most of this is tied as just a basic nymph. Not really a whole lot different. Tying in that mono is really the only other part. But like I said, you know, these things are huge fish catchers. Fish feed on olives all the time. If you can find some slack water where these nymphs are going to go and try to escape the current and try to emerge in peace, that's really where you want to be throwing these. Just throw it in there, give it a little bit of a twitch, and hang on, man. When fish are on to blue wings, they really feed heavily on them. Okay, so there's that. Any questions or anything, leave them in the comments. It's a pretty straightforward fly, but that little bead there does add a little bit extra, and it really does help. So again, any questions, leave them in the comments, and we'll go from there. Okay, thanks.